I couldn't quite find a picture of it, but as an undergraduate, a freshman at the University of Minnesota, several days a week, I would walk by graffiti on the Washington Avenue Bridge that said, "Jesus saves sinners and redeems them for valuable cash prizes." And it was irreverent, but for whatever reason, it tickled my funny bone all the time. And the reason I even remember it is that right about that time during my freshman year, Pastor Stephanie, who is the pastor at the church that I was attending, gave a sermon that got me thinking. She taught that if we proclaim Jesus saves, then you have to know from what. To be saved, you have to know from what you're being saved. I had never thought about it like that before. And so it got me thinking about my own faith. What am I being saved from? So I grew up in the United Church of Christ. And one of my favorite lines from the statement of faith is, God seeks in holy love to save all people from aimlessness and sin. And I've always liked that my faith causes me to live in a way, to live differently, that saves me from aimlessness and sin. Gives me purpose and passion in this life. The path of discipleship makes my life fuller with the hope of healing no matter what I face. Now, what I didn't know back then was that I had a very synoptic perspective. Now, that word synoptic, it means Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those three Gospels. They all have a very similar view. Sin, same, optics, view. They have a very similar way of looking at things. But during Lent, we are looking particularly at the perspective of the other gospel, the Gospel of John, the one that I'm calling the Uneasy Gospel. And so it was during that freshman year that there was a Christian group on campus that was trying to recruit me. And their recruiter was a really nice guy, very enthusiastic. And he knew that I worshiped at a little church near campus. And in the course of getting to know me, he asked, "Are you saved?" And I remember I was like, there was that saved thing again. I knew the answer to this one now. So I answered yes. And I should have stopped there. But I didn't. I'd had all these insights. And I told him about the sermon that I had heard a few weeks before and how I was been thinking about what I was saved from. And I told him about that. What I found out that was from his perspective, I was clearly not saved.
Here's a well-known passage that Shay referred to a few weeks ago. God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him won't perish, but will have eternal life. God didn't send his Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Here is another from John's Gospel. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever doesn't believe in the Son won't see life, but the angry judgment of God remains on them.
From a Johannine perspective, from John's perspective, being saved is all about eternal life. You are saved, and it isn't a question, you are saved from death. Now, my enthusiastic friend had a very, to use the theology word, Johannine soteriology. He was very John about what he believed about being saved. And he was pretty sure that my eternal soul was in danger. That I was confused about the nature of true salvation. In terms of being saved, he was in, I was not. It was close, but wasn't quite there yet. And I left that conversation feeling kind of irritated and judged, and I definitely did not want to go to his Bible study. Now, last week, we considered the perspective, and the context in which John wrote his gospel, because it is quite different from the others. Now, it was written many decades after the first one that we have in the Bible, which is Mark. And the world changed a lot during those decades. Whereas in Mark's time, Christians and Jews, they worshiped together in the same place. They had the same holidays, same traditions. And John saw his community coming apart. Jews and Christians were beginning to go their separate ways. For a few generations, Christians had lived and worshiped with Jews, but after the destruction of Jerusalem, things had changed. Communities were divided. People who were deciding who was with them and who was not. And John felt the pain of rejection. He felt the pain of this division. And he was hurt. And it was important to him to be able to say who's in and who's out. He drew the line along shared belief. So the days of Mark are gone. Those early days are gone. And where Mark was writing, and it was this invitation to people to ask about Jesus. Who do you say that this man was? By John's day, the expectation is that every person has to make a statement of belief that Jesus is God. And that by that belief be granted the gift of eternal life. Being saved from death to eternal life was the ultimate expression of who's in and who's out. And all of this makes me feel a little uneasy. It makes me uneasy when Christians begin judging one another, or anyone else really, about who's in, who's out. It makes me uneasy that rather than placing your trust in God, it becomes about who's holding the right belief about God, who is selling the correct brand of Jesus, the brand that saves. It makes me uneasy when people try to use Jesus' words in an attempt to put the fear of God into someone else.
I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me.
Here's the thing. Because of my uneasiness about all of the judging and the way that that verse can be taken coercively to make people afraid, to force them into a position of making a certain statement, all of this stuff around being saved, I don't talk about eternal life that often. And yet, what is to come when we shuffle off this mortal coil is something that everyone wonders about at some point. Now, like me, this may not be central to your life's and your faith's journey, but the mystery of what may lie beyond shouldn't be avoided. So this morning, I'd like to share with you some of the questions that I have. And more than that, lots more than me just telling you what questions are in my mind, I am really curious about things that you think. Because this is a great mystery. So we've got that hashtag if you want to tweet things out to it, or if you just want to write it on your bulletin, share it with me. I would be very curious. I've wondered, will my spirit recognize the people that I have known and loved in this life? Or does the spirit that's encased in this body of clay and dust and dirt, does it just become part of one great spirit where we don't recognize one another?
In John's story, before Jesus' death, he said, "Don't be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. My Father's house has room to spare. If that weren't the case, would I have told you I'm going to prepare a place for you? When I go to prepare a place for you, I will return and take you to be with me, so that where I am, you will be too. You know the way to the place I'm going."
So in this, Jesus gives a view of a large house. It's very concrete. Everybody can imagine a large house. Sometimes it's called a mansion. And it's a very concrete image, and it relates to the life that we know. A life where we are known. A home where you are called by name and valued. And so one of the happiest moments in my life, if I were to go to say if there was a moment that I felt just almost pure joy, was a camping trip that our family took through Glacier Park when Miles was just a baby. We made him sleep in a box because we were afraid that we would roll over on him. And on that trip, hiking, my spirit felt so content and glad and at ease. And so sometimes when I have one of those concrete images of what I imagine the life to come to be like, I imagine it as a family road trip like that, where we get to explore the universe for eternity. There are other times when the idea of spending eternity in a minivan with my kids does not sound as tempting. And I've wondered about our relationship. So much of my life is defined by roles. I'm a father, a spouse, a pastor. I'm a son. I'm a friend. When I imagine encountering my mother in the life to come, I imagine that she is my mother. She retains that special relationship with me, as do my boys, my spouse. Yet even so, I wonder how that will really be. I even worry about that sometimes because it's hard for me to imagine myself stripped of those roles. How will we know each other? Now, I will tell you, for now in this life, I just chalk this up to one of those things that God has well covered. I'm going to trust that. And it's going to be okay. But I do wonder. One of my greatest mentors used to say, now that is a question for paradise. And he would say this when we reached a question that there was no way of knowing the answer to. And so I've always wondered if by knowing God fully, as the Apostle Paul puts it, will I have access to the knowledge of all things? Because that would be so cool. I wonder about that. What will I know? Oh, and I have wondered, I have imagined, like the way that I imagine God to be, I have wondered for a long time that does God change, does our perception of God change depending on how we imagine God to be? And I go back to a parable of Jesus to make me wonder this. If we imagine that God is gracious and wonderful, wants the best for us, then that's the God we get. And if we imagine that God is a harsh judge just waiting to squash us, then that's the God you get. I've wondered about that. And there is that big question, and the one that we've got to come back to. The one that John raised to as his community was coming apart. What is the role of Jesus in life and death? I'd like you to listen deeply to these words from John. Listen beyond the divisions, beyond the anger and the hurt that he was feeling. Just listen deeply.
I assure you that I am the gate of the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and outlaws, but the sheep didn't listen to them. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief enters only to steal, kill, and destroy. I came so that they could have life, indeed, so that they could live life to the fullest. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. When the hired hand sees the wolf coming, he leaves the sheep and runs away. That's because he isn't the shepherd. The sheep aren't really his. So the wolf attacks the sheep and scatters them. He's only a hired hand, and the sheep don't matter to him. I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep, and they know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I give up my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that don't belong to this sheep pen. I must lead them too. They will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock with one shepherd.
Despite all the ways that we are divided, all of the alienation that we can feel from one another in the human family, Jesus recognizes that there are other pens. Pens with those that you may disagree with, you might dislike. Pens with those who do things differently. But some way, somehow, the good shepherd must lead them too. Ultimately, we are one human flock, sustained by bread, united by humanity, loved passionately by the God who creates and redeems us all in this life and the next. The faith of Jesus is to acknowledge oneness, that there is one Lord, many pens, but one shepherd. So as this church, as we lean in with wonder and ask these questions, let's now stand and pray that we let our loving know no boundaries, no pens, with our hymn, Draw the Circle Wide, which is in our bulletin or on screen. Please rise.